6. Psalm 26. Short psalm. Could be a quick teaching, we'll see. Let's look at the first few verses. It indicates it is a psalm of David at the beginning. And in David's words, he says, "Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. I have also trusted in the Lord. I shall not slip. Examine me, O Lord, and prove me. Try my mind and my heart. For your loving kindness is before my eyes, and I have walked in your truth." And so David begins the psalm as an appeal. And David's appeal to God is from a position of firmness. He's standing on a firm foundation as he makes this appeal to God. And he's able to stand upon the fact that he's trusted in the Lord. He says that there in his opening words. And I think it's important for us to note right off the bat the confidence that a firm foundation like that brings to a person when they're interacting with God. I mean, to be able to say, I trusted in God before approaching him allows for a comfort and an assurance when requests are made of him or when we bring our burdens to him. It's always a lot easier when we know we've been right with him when we come to pray. It's usually when we've not been right or we've been in sin or we have something unconfessed and we come with nerves and we come with an uncomfortableness because we know that he knows. So to come with that firm foundation as David is in this psalm is always something that makes the whole interaction so much better. So David came to the Lord with this confidence and he's asking him for vindication. And vindicate here means to judge. It means to pronounce a sentence. So in essence, David was asking the Lord to find him either guilty or innocent. And if he found him guilty, to issue an appropriate punishment. Now, as David talks to the Lord, he reminds the Lord, he pleads his case by establishing his condition before the throne. He says not only has he trusted in the Lord, he's also walked in integrity. And we see that word integrity from time to time in Scripture, and it's always a good place to really do an inventory about our own integrity. Can we say that we are a person of integrity? Could that be challenged by others that know us and know things about us? What would the Lord think? That's the most important thing to consider. So in other words, David proclaims that he is innocent, clean, and has walked in an upright manner. And we can take from these claims that David has been spoken of or accused of conduct opposite of his claims. There must be that experience in his life which brought him to actually write this psalm. I mean, some individual or a group of people had accused David of fraternizing with ungodly men and being untrue to the Lord, and that will play out as we read the rest of the psalm. So anyway, he pleads his own defense. Now, we have to realize David was not claiming to be sinless. He knew that, knew better than that. We should always know better than that. We could say we're clean because of where we're at and the things that we're doing, and yet we know that we're sinners saved by grace. But he's pleading not guilty here to the specific things that were charged against him, the accusations that were made against him. He's able to say that he's clean and innocent of those things. And despite that difficulty, he says, I shall not slip. In other words, he would not waver from his trust and would not sacrifice his integrity no matter the false accusations that have been leveled against him. And I thought about that a lot as I was studying, and I think that's like an extremely important example for us in our day. I mean, if you think about our day, we were just having a conversation before church just about the difficulties of our culture. I mean, not just from a spectator standpoint, looking at our culture and seeing the ugliness that has really risen up, but even how to interact with our culture, to interact with people in our culture that don't think like us. And it's not that we're supposed to judge, but we're forced in so many cases to interact with people that have made decisions about what's right and wrong that we wouldn't necessarily agree with. And in our day, it seems that there is really no concern for truth. People have lost their sense of decency and fairness. Depraved morals and perversions are held up as virtues. And anything that's pure and righteous is ridiculed and rejected. Now, that's not necessarily new. I just think we've come to a point where it's voluminous. We're dealing with it more and more every day. So in an environment like ours, we need to work hard to maintain our integrity because it's being challenged. And it's easy to sacrifice it and not even know it because we're so tied up to the things that are going on around us. And we need to be like David and claim that we will not slip. We will not waver from trusting the Lord and claim that we will continue to walk in our integrity and in the Lord's truth. And I think there's only one way, well, there's probably more than one way, but I know one way to do that is to have a viewpoint about the things that we see that is biblical, a biblical viewpoint. I mean, that's like a real important concept because if we look at the world aside from our biblical influence, then we're either going to agree that it's okay what we see or we're not going to care because we don't have that reference. And as Christians, we really have to have that as our foundation, of that biblical worldview, so we can judge things rightly by God's word, to know what's right, what's wrong, and be able to stand on that and know it's not just my opinion, it's what God has said. Back when I first came to this church years ago, we went through a thing. They didn't have midweek services back then, and so to start midweek services, we went through something maybe some of you have been through, the Truth Project. How many people have been through the Truth Project? Okay, maybe we need to do it again. I wish they had updated it because it's actually pretty old. And actually, I looked today. I was thinking about you can't even get the DVDs anymore. And they said they're hoping to get them back in. Anyway, but that's what the whole Truth Project is about. It's like a 13-week study. And it was about having a biblical worldview. And it's challenging because you see how many things you don't judge biblically, that you judge in a worldly fashion because that's where we live. It's what influences us. You know, I think Paul really had an eye on this whole idea of integrity when he began to draft what we all have come to know as the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. At the very outset of the components of the armor, he speaks of one thing in particular that I believe speaks so loudly of this idea of integrity. And just the very beginning of that portion of Ephesians 6, Paul says, "Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the evil day, and having done all to stand, stand therefore." And then the first piece of the armor that he describes, he says, having girded your waist with truth. So he begins with this thing called the belt of truth. That's how we commonly talk about it. And remember, he was at that time, all around him were Roman guards. He was used to the Roman soldiers, the way they dressed. And I'm sure that was part of the influence of what he had in his mind as he wrote, but he made it a spiritual thing other than a physical thing. But when you think about that belt of truth, and I know many of you heard me teach on this before, but just looking at the person in their common dress of the day, how they would have dressed to go and work, on their farm or whatever it would have been, they basically wore a tunic, a big old rectangular piece of cloth with holes for arms, hole for the head that they draped over themselves, which you can imagine that tunic was kind of in the way. And so when they went out to work or to run or to walk, they would reach down literally between their legs, grab up that extra cloth, they'd pull it up between their legs, and they would tuck it into their belt to form sort of a pair of pants, as opposed to the tunic or a dress, if you will, that was hanging down. Why did they do that? They did that so that the material of the tunic wouldn't trip them up. And when you live a life of truth, truly live a life of truth, what you've done is you've eliminated those things that will trip you up. You've taken those things that are flapping in the wind that someone else could get a hold of, or would get attached to something as you went through your day that would trip you up, that would lend itself to making you dishonest in some sense, less truthful in some sense, a liar possibly in other cases. And so the whole idea of integrity is our life being contained in a godly way so that there aren't those loose things out there that would trip us up and cause us to not be able to walk in that godly path. Usually when I teach about that, I talk I bring in a Navy example in the fact that on a ship, a Navy ship, one of the largest things that is a concern is what's called ship's integrity. And ship's integrity can be compromised when a compartment, which would be what you and I would think of as a room, a compartment within that ship is damaged. The hull maybe is damaged, and they're taking on water. Let's just use that example. And if that compartment in that ship is not dealt with, it could compromise the integrity of the entire ship, which is why people on a ship or a submarine are trained on what to do. How do I dog that door shut in order that maybe that one compartment will get lost, but the overall integrity of the ship will remain? Well, you can make that an analogy for our lives. What compartments do we have in our life that could be compromised? And if we're not quick to secure that compartment, how much damage will it do to the rest of our lives? And so I think that's always just a good picture in our mind of keeping things in an orderly fashion so that we're not tripped up by those things or others around us can't get a hold of those things and make our life a mess. And the chapter before that in Ephesians chapter 5, there's another set of verses I think really feed into this. In chapter 5, Ephesians verse 15 and 16, it says, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil." Well, that certainly describes our times. The days are evil and becoming more evil. And then it gives us this warning that I think fits into this whole idea of maintaining our integrity, to walk circumspectly. Now, that's not a word we use every day in our vocabulary. So what does this particular phrase from the Greek actually mean, circumspect? It means exactly. It means diligently. It can mean perfectly. So walk exactly. In other words, your steps are determined. They're not just willy-nilly. We don't end up where we don't want to be because we knew where we were going. So walk circumspectly. I think that also includes just being aware of your surroundings. Have a purpose in what you're doing. Don't let the world decide or others decide necessarily where you're going, especially if you're trying to maintain a walk with God. And then he says, not as fools, but as wise. It's wise to walk circumspectly, foolish to not. And then redeeming the time. I don't know about you, but I can lose a lot of time. And I think sometimes how silly it is when I say to myself, I don't have time. And then I realize the time that I waste. So redeeming the time, but why? Because the days are evil, which means I need to walk circumspectly, knowing that I need to use my time wisely, because if I don't, something of the world is probably going to fill it in. And it's something that's going to maybe risk that integrity that we're talking about. And that word redeeming there means to buy up, or I love it also means to rescue. Rescue your time back from the things that would steal it. Now, in verse 3 that we read here in the psalm, David says he keeps the Lord's loving kindness before his eyes. And that's another tool in the fight against an ugly culture, in maintaining our integrity. And it takes me to Philippians chapter 4, and I know every time I read this, some people are uncomfortable. And the reason, if that's you, that you're uncomfortable is because this is so not the world. This just seems like just nobody would want to actually do this, would they? Because that means the world would laugh at us if we told people that this is what we believe is a tool to maintain our integrity. What am I talking about? Well, Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. It says, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on those things." Actually, it says these things. And like I said, that to the world, that would seem just kind of silly. I mean, that doesn't even sound exciting or fun, does it? But yet those things are so important, because what that does is it puts our mind in a godly mindset. It puts our heart in the ways of God, because those are God's virtues. Those are God's characteristics. Those are godly ways that we should be not only conducting ourselves, but the things that should guide our mind. And it's interesting because the very next verse, Philippians 4:9, says, do this, and the God of peace will be with you. And so I think it's really important that we remember. And that would be really turning away from the things of the world again and having that biblical worldview, even down to the way that we think and the things that we meditate on. Let's pick up in verse 4 of our text. I have not sat with idolatrous mortals, nor will I go in with hypocrites. I have hated the assembly of evildoers and will not sit with the wicked. So to sit with idolatrous mortals means to approve their practices. And David had not done that. So here he's defending himself. And David described the idol worshipers as mortals. It's not a word we use often. But he did that because it was helpful for him to remember and for them to know that their lives were short. They were but mortals. And they would eventually have to answer to the true and living God instead of idols of their own making. David also knew that to associate with hypocrites meant to be a willing partner with deceivers and pretenders. But David hadn't done that either, and that's the case he's making. On the contrary, he hated the companionship of criminals and had determined to avoid fraternizing with the wicked. I believe David in his heart had that wisdom that Paul had shared in 1 Corinthians. In the 15th chapter, 33rd verse, Paul said, do not be deceived, evil company corrupts bad habits. Evil company corrupts good habits. I sounded like the world there for a moment. You know, we also heard this wisdom in the very first psalm that we studied, Psalm number 1. I'm going to read that to us again. Psalm 1 said this, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. So that's the godly. That's what we've been talking about. That's the man, that's the woman of integrity with a God-like conduct and with a biblical worldview. It says that they will prosper. They will be like trees planted by the rivers of water, bring forth its fruit in its season, shall not wither. And isn't it interesting? We just got done reading a whole list of things that we're to meditate upon. And that's what it says here, that person, that godly person will meditate. It says here on the law, which speaks of the word of God, both day and night. But then the psalm finishes speaking about the ungodly, the ones that had accused David wrongly. In verse 4 of that psalm, it says, the ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. And so we have great support for making that a priority, to walk in a godly way, to maintain our integrity, and to stand upon the truth of God. Look at verse 6. I will wash my hands in innocence, so I will go about your altar, O Lord, that I may proclaim with the voice of thanksgiving and tell of all your wondrous works. Now, David didn't think, as I said before, that he was sinless or even without fault. He needed to wash his hands, but did so with the innocence of a clear conscience before God. He approached God's altar for both atonement and for offering thanksgiving. He saw atonement, and then he responded with worship. And that really should be, anytime we really think about forgiveness, the forgiveness that we received, or if we're in that situation where we have something to confess to the Lord, once we've confessed, realizing we are forgiven, then really our worship of him should be the next step, that we would understand how great that is and how great he is, and we would just want to worship him. And that's really the heart that David has here as he makes his case before the Lord. And I thought about that too, because you think during the past 2 years, literally 2 years, I mean, we've witnessed people take their personal hygiene to extreme levels. The mantra to wash hands, use sanitizer, was used like the words of a hypnotist to mesmerize the masses. I mean, how great would it be if the masses would be as concerned with the real plague of sin and the need to wash their hands of their wicked actions, have their mouths sanitized from wicked words and their heart from wicked desires? I mean, it's just interesting what the world responds to and what it ignores. And really, we know, I mean, when we look around, the problem can be called all kinds of things, but it's a sin problem. It's been a sin problem since the garden. But that's not what people want to consider. It's not what people want to hear. And those of us that are on the side that we're on, we can look at it with the eyes that God's given us to see it. But it's not something the world's going to pay attention to. And then David adds, "So will I go about your altar." It's kind of an interesting, really a little bit hard to explain what he meant by that. The best we know, there wasn't a ritual practice of walking around or dancing around God's altar among the ancient Hebrews. So perhaps David's thinking along the lines of the spiritual sacrifices of praise. Maybe he sees himself joining in like a jubilant group of worshipers around the altar. Or maybe he did think of literal sacrifice. And if he did, maybe what he's picturing is that the offering was of so many animals at one time that the sacrifices themselves circled the altar. Not sure exactly what he meant, but he definitely sees himself at the altar as he makes this appeal to God. Look at verse 8. "Lord, I have loved the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells." It's such a cool verse. I mean, David celebrates the experience of being in the presence of the Lord. And he acknowledges this in an earlier psalm, Psalm 16. He said, "In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." And we're going to read more about that sentiment in the next psalm, Psalm 27. But for now, just a couple verses from that next psalm. He says, "One thing I have desired of the Lord that I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret place of his tabernacle he shall hide me. He shall set me high upon a rock." And so we just hear this great joy that he had about being in the presence of the Lord and how much that he would seek that and what it really looked like to him. I mean, we can just tell David loves the presence of the Lord. And he also adds here, he loved the earthly dwelling place of his glory, which would have been the tabernacle for David in his time, the temple eventually, because that's where in the Holy of Holies, and we see the examples when the glory of God would fill the temple. And then from Proverbs chapter 24, verse 3 and 4, it says, "Through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches," which I think is just a really beautiful picture of the dwelling place that David would have in his mind, where God's glory was at. So for all this, David's only response to these truths was to worship. And we hear that response in other of David's Psalms and some of the other writers of Psalms. I want to read from several different places just that idea of the thanksgiving and the worship that David and others had just for God's presence in the assembly. From Psalm 35, verse 18, he said, "I will give you thanks in the great assembly. I will praise you among many people." And then David wrote in Psalm 40, verse 9 and 10, he said, "I have proclaimed the good news of righteousness in the great assembly. Indeed, I do not restrain my lips, O Lord. You yourself know. I have not hidden your righteousness within my heart. I have declared your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your loving kindness and your truth from the great assembly." And then a different writer of Psalms in Psalm 89, verse 5, it says, "And the heavens will praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness also in the assembly of the saints." And then from Psalm 107, verse 32, it said, "Let them exalt him who also in the assembly of the people and praise him in the company of the elders. And so we see this continuous praise on the heart of God's people. We realize the heavenly picture, the heavenly hosts surrounding the altar of God, the throne of God, worshiping him day and night. And so that should definitely fill us as we consider these things that David is speaking of. Look at verse 9 and 10. Do not gather my soul with sinners, nor my life with bloodthirsty men, in whose hands is a sinister scheme, and whose right hand is full of bribes. So in light of David's great need and his great trust in God, he asked God to preserve his life. He refused to associate with the wicked in life. He asked God to keep him from sinners and death. In these verses, we can see the picture of the sheep and the goats. We read about that in Matthew chapter 25, that Jesus spoke regarding the final judgment, and also the picture of the wheat and the tares existing together in the church. Because the fact is, David couldn't stop the hypocrites from being part of the congregation. He could only refuse to be like them and thereby maintain his integrity. And we know that a day will come when God will separate them, and it will be to their demise for the wicked. And then look at 11 and 12. David says, but as for me, I will walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be merciful to me. My foot stands in an even place. In the congregations, I will bless the Lord. So David now asked to be saved from the doom of the wicked because he'd lived a righteous life. And he asked to be handled with all the grace of God. But then he commits himself. He commits to a continued walk of integrity. So it wasn't that he just mentioned that he was a man of integrity. He committed more than once in this psalm to walk in that integrity, to maintain it. And he makes the commitment regardless of the danger to his life and despite the presence of the wicked. So that, again, should give us some motivation as we're surrounded by a wicked world, that we're still to maintain that godly walk, to maintain our integrity. And we see that he's confident in this position because he says, my foot stands in an even place. So he knows he stands on level ground. And that's a repeat, if you were paying attention, that's a repeat of the confidence in the first verse, where he proclaimed, I shall not slip. So he proclaims that at the beginning, he proclaims that at the end, having made his case and leaving it there on the altar for God to judge. And he concludes the psalm with a confident promise. He says, in the congregation, I will bless the Lord. And I saw this quote by Charles Spurgeon that I thought kind of was a nice summary of this psalm. And he said, the song began in the the song began in the minor, but it has now reached the major key. Saints often sing themselves into happiness. The even place upon which our foot stands is the sure covenant faithfulness, eternal promise, and immutable oath of the Lord of hosts. There is no fear of falling from his solid basis or of its being removed from under us. And really that's the key and really the motivation to maintain our integrity. Because if we know that we have maintained our integrity, then we know we stand on a firm foundation, that those things that could flap in the wind to cause us problem have been taken care of, and no one's got anything on us, you might say, and we know we're right before the Lord. And so we don't have any fear then, as Mr. Spurgeon said, of falling from that solid basis or having it removed from under us. And so a lot to be said for that whole effort towards keeping your life integral. So we will rest there for tonight. Told you it was a short one.